It's tea time, and today I'm going to try hibiscus tea, which is a tea I bought from Walmart after I said I wasn't going to buy any more tea. So, while I try this tea out, I'm going to recount the last time I had a cup of coffee. And the last time I had a cup of coffee, it was after my mother's cremation. I went with my grandmother, who I had just seen for the first time in probably a year and a half, 2 years almost. And we went to the cafe that I went to with her and my grandfather growing up. And my grandfather was kind of like my father figure, though if I had ever stepped out of place and called him my father or insinuated that he was my father, he was very quick and adamant in correcting me that he was not my father, that he was Grandpa. I could call him Grandpa. But this is what the tea bag looks like, and it's plastic, which is usually a bad sign. And the tea bag is just like the one with my special green tea. It's stuck down in the bag for some reason, and you pull it out gently. So that's interesting. But this story that she began telling me once we got to the cafe and we were sitting there with our cups of coffee was about the man that was supposedly my father. Or he was one of 3 men that I was introduced to as a child that was supposedly my father, which is a trauma that I never quite actually registered. The trauma of being introduced to 3 men as your father, who then all walked out of your life. But truthfully, it didn't affect me in the way you might think, because at that point in my life, I was so terrified of men and so against the idea of having a man in my life that I had that sort of biological connection to, because I only had bad relationships with men, and it was having that degree of separation that made it livable and manageable for me. So my grandmother began telling me the story of how she met the man that is definitely my older brother's father and my mother's first, real partner. And she said that she was very upset when my mother brought him home because he was kind of stupid. And when I tried to get her to elaborate on what she meant, by like stupid and did these things that she didn't like, she didn't really have good answers for it. And in one case, she told me a story of a tornado, a warning that had went out, and they were living in a trailer. So anyways, supposedly there was a tornado warning that had went out in their area, and my grandma was living in a trailer at the time. And she recounted this story of kind of disgust around this man who, at the thought of standing, experiencing out a tornado in a trailer, was so full of fear that he was throwing up and crying, and they had to drive him away to go to a place that had a basement for him to wait this storm out. And that was just one instance. And this is the tea right now. It is crimson as my lipstick is. It actually matches. And I'm going to go ahead and try it now before I continue. Whew. It's very tart. It's incredibly tart, and I can tell that if I poured any milk into this, even my almond milk, it would curdle immediately. And it's pretty good, though I don't know if it's my favorite. I'd probably put some sweetener in it. But to continue with the stories, she also cited another time when my grandfather had got this man a job, and it was a manual labor job, because that's the kind of person my grandfather was. He was very handy with his hands, and his hands were always rough, and he always smelled like motor oil. But at one point, he had lost track of this man while they were working, and he went out to discover him running from mud puddle to mud puddle, catching frogs. And my grandma told me the story, and she was completely disgusted by this behavior. And I remember sitting there and thinking to myself that I would be completely charmed by a man running from mud puddle to mud puddle catching frogs. That would be the most charming thing that I probably ever had seen. And then for the third story, it was actually so much more alarming. My grandmother told me about how my mother had cheated on this man, and this man was so upset over it. And my mother had made him suicidal, apparently, and he had taken a bottle of pills because he didn't want her to leave or something like that. And my grandma was like, idiot. It didn't work because, we called the cops, and he went to the hospital and had his stomach pumped. And I remember just the complete disregard for this man's life over seemingly insignificant things. I can't hear in these stories anything that was explicitly wrong that he did. And I remember thinking to myself that for the first time in my life, perhaps this is the man that is my father. Because it really does align quite well. And it makes me wonder what on earth made them think that a better father figure for me would be the man that I grew up having me called retard and pussy, who was constantly trying to toughen me up by having you line up to be hit across the room. So it just made me wonder. It's like one of those family secrets that comes out after years. And my grandma always insisted, there's no way this man's your father, even though he was one of the 3 I was introduced to. And he is the father of my older brother. But anyways, this tea is very tart, but it's pretty good. I think I might add some sweetener to it to make it a little better. The sweetener does make it slightly better, but it still is it's one of those teas that you have on a very specific kind of day. Anyways, thank you. Anyways, as for the cup of coffee, I remember I drank about half of it, I think, with some sweetener and some cream. And I remember halfway through her storytelling that I had this very vivid daydream where I was thinking about my mother's bones being incinerated, and as they were being incinerated, her spirit being released from her body. And I have no desire to ever drink another cup of coffee again.